Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Okay, welcome back here to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism, with myself, Adam Piercy, and Mick Mulroy. So today we were going to talk about Stoicism and the military. This was one of the initial episode concepts that actually Mick and I had discussed well before we started recording, and I had always thought that was a good topic to start us with. And so today I think we're going to focus a little bit on history as well as modern times and Stoicism present in the military today, as well as maybe hear from Mick a little bit on his personal experience and what he's willing to share. So Mick, I appreciate you being open to talk about that today. It's I think a really good topic, and there's been a lot of discussions about it, I think, in the last little bit from Ryan Holiday and others. So, but I think maybe we should start a little bit from the beginning. So, because a lot of people ask, there's a wonder about whether or not Stoicism is militaristic or not. I think that's a lot of questions we get. And I think there's another thing, which is that people are wondering if Stoicism is a proponent of violence or not, or if it's a proponent of military action or not. And, will we be able to answer all those today? I don't know, but we'll see where we can get to. But you and I were talking just before this, and you said what I was thinking, which was, start at the beginning with Socrates, which is, I think, a good place. So why don't you lead us in here and tell us a little bit about your knowledge from Socrates and his military background?
Sure. And I'd start off by saying that the military, generally speaking, is not a proponent of violence, right? It's prepared for it in the hopeful that it doesn't happen event that it does, right? So that you can defend the nation. In fact, I think most people that have served in combat are going to be less likely to enter a war than those chicken hawks that haven't, so to speak. But starting with Socrates, a great example of it, actually. So most people view Socrates as, this kind of doddering, philosophical old man walking around Athens, pontificating on lofty subjects. And perhaps in some ways he was, but before he was that, he was a hero, not just a soldier, but a heroic one. He was sent during the Peloponnesian War. That's a war between Athens and Sparta. He served up till he was like 40 years old. So essentially would have been the equivalent of a sergeant major, is the way most refer to him as. But that soldier that is responsible for all the other soldiers' well-being. He received the equivalent of the Medal of Honor, which the U.S. would call the Medal of Honor, so the highest award for valor, twice, and turned them down twice, right? And he really, I think, epitomized the servant leader in the sense that if you read the accounts of him, and plenty of his soldiers went on to be very famous, including Alcibiades, one of the key linchpins eventually in Spartan's success in the Peloponnesian War. But his life was saved by Socrates. So he had many of his students were not only students of his, they were former soldiers of his. And I think the way I would see it, if you think of what impresses young men, particularly, one aspect would be a war hero, right? So it might be that Socrates had such influence because of his service. And in his service, what I was going to say, the servant leadership, which the Marine Corps and many other special operations type forces emulate, is Socrates would take the watch for his men all the time, right? So watch at night is just what it sounds like. You never go to sleep, right? You have to have somebody up making sure you're not, going to get attacked at night. And so periodic, and still happens today, even when we're in garrison, somebody's up at all times. in the barracks. Um, Certainly in combat, it takes on more importance, and it's usually more than one person that's awake. But the point being, Socrates would take his watch or take the watch of many of his younger soldiers so they could sleep. He'd also give up his rations to soldiers that needed it and go without. So the kind of quintessential idea of the Stoic, what I call the Stoic soldier, really came from Socrates, who many consider, including myself, and I think you as well, the godfather of Stoicism, right? So,
Yeah,
kind of
absolutely.
all the uh, strands of Western philosophy kind of flowed from Socrates,
Yeah.
including um, Stoicism, and he really does epitomize that kind of version of what I think the Stoics hold up as a model, a Stoic soldier. Also, Cato, of course, we can get to, but
Yeah.
certainly Socrates, I think, was the prototype for many things, including the concept of the Stoic soldier.
Yeah, and you mentioned Cato, who famously fought Julius Caesar at Utica and lost, but stood up for what he thought was right and did perform a military leader role. And then you go right through to Marcus, who obviously is the emperor, is commanding troops on the frontier, fighting against I think it's the Pannonians or the Marcomanni up in
Yep,
Carnuntum, for
Germania.
example, where he
Yeah.
wrote part of the Meditations. So
Yes.
I don't. I agree with you. Like I think there's definitely all these marks of history of being tied in with the military, but would also agree with you as well that I think to think that Stoicism is militaristic or violent or forward defense or something like that is really something I would say that that's a bit of a stretch when you look at in history. I mean, Socrates does not seem to be a violent person. He doesn't want to be violent. He wants to talk things out with people. Marcus himself he fights to sue for peace. He doesn't fight and then annihilate these tribes that he's fighting against. He turns them into allies. And we were talking about that recently on another episode. So, I think that's definitely there. There are other
Yeah.
interesting, prominent people who at least use Stoicism in the military later. You and I have talked a little bit about George Washington, right? And he's
Yes.
citing, I think he's citing Seneca, and there's a play that's done before.
Yeah,
Is
it's a
it
play
Valley?
about Cato the
Yeah,
Younger, right? So it's his
play about
final
Cato. Yeah,
stand, right? So it was before Valley Forge, I believe.
yeah,
He
yeah,
had his men watch a play about Cato, which I think was two parts, right? One, Cato was the quintessential Stoic soldier, right? So
yeah,
courageous in the face of all odds, which at the time, we always view it from the point of view of success because we're looking back in time. But at the time,
yeah.
George Washington had no idea how this was going to work out, right? I,
Right.
I, I imagine if they were betting in Vegas on the American Revolution, it would have been betting against it, to be
Yeah,
frank. And I think General Washington was looking at the potential for being a Cato like figure, for
yeah.
failing to fight against tyranny in his
Hmm.
perspective, just like Cato's perspective was fighting against an autocrat, and potentially losing and being in Cato's position. So I
Yeah,
think it was both a view for his men to see inspiration, but also to understand the consequences of what they were doing.
yeah,
They would all be considered treasonous, right, from the crown,
yeah,
for rebelling against the crown. But they went against it, and and I agree with you, Adam. I don't think there's anything militaristic about Stoicism. There's just traits that easily carry over, right?
yeah,
The courage, justice, wisdom, the self discipline, right? I
yeah,
mean, these are all things that are not only part of the military; they're essential to being a good military, right?
yeah, yeah.
So it is, and you look at even Musanius Rufus, who wasn't, I think he was not a soldier, he was a teacher rather, but even his like rules on life to be able to have self discipline, to push yourself physically, mentally,
Yeah.
to test yourself, so that when you do potentially get into a situation where you have to go without, you're ready, right? So, and then George Washington's obvious example. Another example I'd say would be Winston Churchill, who's, I don't
Sure.
know that he would have called himself a Stoic, but he certainly um, talked a lot about it and read a lot about it. And
Yeah.
Churchill was not just the prime minister, right? He was an army officer who fought in multiple wars, and his service was valorous. Um, Admiral Stockdale. If you ever want to
Yes.
read, a person who literally connected himself to a Stoic philosopher, right? His book, The Philosophy of Fighter Pilot, I think was the actual name, right? Exceptional. My old boss, for example, General Mattis, carried a copy of the Meditations wherever he went. The national security advisor when I was in government, the last job, General McMaster, well-known Stoic, speaks on it quite a bit. It's very common in the military, and for example, my son, when he was going through Ranger School a couple of years back, during one of the phases, I guess the mountain phase, they have access to a library, especially if you get recycled. That's all you have is you PT and go to the library. He said, like, not only were all the books of Stoicism in there, but all the modern books, our friend Ryan, our friend Donald, and just go down the list, all their books were in there. And the way it works is your parents or friends can send you books. You just have to leave them. So he said there was like multiple books of,
Yeah.
The Obstacle is a Way, for example, to give
Yeah.
Ryan a shout out. He said it was, and they were probably the most commonly read books. So it's a natural attraction, and it is part of the resilience of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and I would assume Space Force in the United States. It's actually an official part of the resilience programs. So it is, and forever will be associated with the military around the world, not just the U.S., of course.
Right. Yeah. So, and why do you think that is? Like, I was going to say that for the latter half, but I think it's important to talk about it now. Like, let's really dive in on why we think that is the case. If I had to look at it from the outside, I would say because you're operating in an environment where you're operating in sort of base human instincts and emotions, right? And so having a guidebook essentially to kind of figure out how to handle that seems like it'd be pretty useful, right? I've never served in the military. I will be open and honest about that. And it's always been fascinating to me why it kind of just feels like it made sense to have the two linked in some way, right? But why do you think that is? Why do you think it's been, something that just has never really gone away?
So the military, in many ways, is an honor-based society, right? It's not about the accumulation of wealth. Obviously, I mean, you don't join the military if you want to be rich, right?
Yeah.
It wouldn't make any sense. It's very fraternal, of course. It is. You have to trust a man or woman to your right or left, with everything, including your life. Not to be overly dramatic, but that's what it is in the battlefield. And there is situations where, if you think about it, a lieutenant, for example, let's just go with the core of any military, the infantry, right, which is what I was. A lieutenant would be in charge of 33 soldiers or Marines if he was an infantry officer. Probably be about 21 years old. Probably be a he too, but there's women infantry officers now, which is great. But either way, that man or woman is a 21-year-old who, in a combat situation, is responsible for the lives of 33 soldiers or Marines that are probably only about 2 to 3, maybe 2 years younger than them, if that. Some will be the same age and a little older. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made on the battlefield. And they are literally life and death decisions. They're extraordinarily moral-based decisions, ethically based decisions. So having that core moral structure is paramount. I mean, when we see a 21-year-old that's in college, we still call him a kid, right? Or we do. We call kids now kids until they're like 30.
Yeah.
In the military context, they're deemed completely an adult as soon as they join the military, as an enlisted or an officer, and they start making life and death decisions in a combat role like we had for the last 20 years almost immediately. So growing up fast, having that strong, if you don't have the strong moral structure, bad things are going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Because not all militaries have it. Plenty of militaries are just essentially, what did Tolstoy call war? Organized murder, right? That is what Stoicism gets away from, not organized murder. We're here to defend those that can't defend themselves, defend our country, to fight in line with what we all deem to be acceptable, which is you don't kill non-combatants, obviously. You don't starve civilians. You attack the enemy and only the enemy. Yes, sometimes civilians get killed, but if it's in your intent to kill civilians, that's a war crime, right? So, and most people that have served in combat try to avoid combat. And that's another reason why I think having former military members, that it doesn't make them a better person, but since they are going to be the commander in chief of whatever military they're going to be responsible for as president or prime minister, etc., it gives them a sense of experience that you can't get without having served in combat, right? On why we should try to avoid combat, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's, I mean, I think people naturally can understand that, but it's,
Yeah.
it's a very visceral sense when you've, you've seen the consequences of war, both to you, your friends, and of course, to the people where all these wars take place. I mean, they're the ones that usually take the brunt of it.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate your view on that because I think the thing that always seems to resonate with me on this one when I describe it and again, I never served, but like why it was an important philosophy for me was I was kind of looking for a compass, right? And you'll see on our new logo, that the compass points are representative of the 4 Stoic virtues, right? And so I guess I'd appreciate your view if you disagree on this, but I do kind of see this as a compass kind of circumstance, right? Like when you're looking at how to treat someone when you're running a platoon or something like that, or I don't know what 33 people is. Is that 3 platoons?
That's one platoon.
Okay. Yeah. That's one platoon. The treatment of them and why you do things certain ways, right? The treatment of them is to be magnanimous, and welcoming to them. That's justice. To be treating them with and helping them be courageous, right? I mean, that's another one of our virtues. So I do see it as a compass, right? That kind of gives direction. So, but at the same time, it's hard for me sometimes to figure out why it's such a strong link, only because I've never served in this circumstance. So I always feel like I'm guessing when I describe it that way. So, but I'm curious though, like, because I think a lot of people from outside of the circumstances where they've served, you were a Marine first, right? You always remind me that, how do you know if somebody's ever been a Marine? Don't worry, they'll tell you, I think is what you said to me, right? So,
and the Irish. You're pretty,
yes, Irish Marine, there you go. Forgetting it all. But I mean, if you're happy to share, I'd love to hear a little bit about how early did you find out that there was this link? Were you already a Marine, or did it come through? Like I know from what you've discussed before, Stoicism, or at least Greek philosophy, was something present in your home. But when you began in the military in your career, was it prevalent right off the bat, or did you kind of come to it later in the military? How did that work?
So like you said, Adam, I was already very familiar with philosophy. My father spoke about it, not just Stoicism. He talked about Plato's, especially allegories of Plato, the cave and many others. But I already considered myself a Stoic, although, as you well know, some people don't like to call themselves Stoics, even though they are Stoics. It's viewed, I guess it's viewed somewhat like arrogant, that if you're calling yourself Stoic, you're calling yourself a sage. So just for clarification, when I call myself Stoic, I don't mean to say that I'm a sage, right? I just mean that I follow the philosophy of Stoicism, right? Yeah. I'm doing the best I can, right?
Absolutely.
Totally. So just to make that clear.
Yeah.
And So when I got in the Marine Corps, enlisted first, went to Paris Island, and the commandant has this thing called a reading list. So you have to read books, to get promoted, which is cool, right? I really like it, and meditations is really early on the list. And there's a lot of books that cite and reference Stoicism, Stoic virtues, and the Stoic soldier, books about Cato. So it was almost immediate where a I was rereading books that I had already read when I got in there, and I was the guy who knew way too much about Marcus Aurelius. Like, how many times you read that book? Already, right? So when I first got in there, but everybody was interested in it because it does, really, it is the backbone of like honor, courage, and commitment is the Marine Corps' like core traits. And that is so in line with Stoicism. And it's so, I mean, if you think about it, during the Roman legion time, essentially every Roman soldier was a Stoic, right? That's what they were, you know?
Yeah.
So it was very common to talk about. And certainly, the thing about the Commandant's reading list is you read the book and then you talk about it with your unit.
Yeah.
What does this mean? What do you think? And so the books that were based on Stoicism uh, were prominent. It wasn't the only books we read, but it was certainly prominent. We also read a lot of theories of war, Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, you know, the ones you'd expect. But I'd
Yeah.
say the other books that were the most common were the books that were either directly, Stoic books, or publications or works, the ones we talk about from Epictetus, Seneca, obviously Marcus Aurelius. But then books that are based on the philosophy that talked specifically about how it applies to the military. So I saw that through my whole career in the Marine Corps, and then you already referenced, but the group that I was in, the CIA, was called Special Activities Center. So it's the covert special operations of the U.S. government. And so, as you guess, everybody was military, right? It was kind of like you went to the military, then you got uh, selected to go into there. So it was kind of the military times 10, if you will. So it was mostly people from uh, JSOC, SOCOM, and definitely combat arms, right? Including the infantry, like me. So, and then it was because of that connection, people talked about Stoicism quite a bit, especially with me, maybe because, I was always rambling on and on about it. And that worked out for me once because one time they had to have somebody go to Greece and stay in Greece. And so literally the dude said, well, it has to be Mulroy, right? Because the guy, I mean, it has to
Yeah.
be him because he's so fascinating with ancient
Yeah.
Greece. So that's the coolest place I got to PCS. But so I saw it literally my whole career, and then I ended up my last job in the government was working for Secretary Mattis. Who
Right.
I think he is what people think he is. Except for that whole mad dog thing. He's not. He's more like a super badass college professor, if you think about it that way. He's not a yeller or a screamer, right? He's very
Right.
stoic, right? Right. So
Yeah.
that I don't think he ever liked that nickname. I don't know where it came from, but he was what most people think, right? So that servant leader, that stoic soldier, like he was famous for as a general showing up at some checkpoint that some lance corporal had to sit at on Christmas Eve and just replacing him.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be here on Christmas. I'm going to stand your post. And then the next, sergeant that came through that post is like, holy crap, that's General Mattis, right?
Yeah.
So those stories are true, right? So, and you could talk to plenty, I work for him and many of my friends work for him
Yeah.
as active Marines. And they're like, it's all true. Yeah, he's the guy was not only a servant leader, but he was very modest. He was famous for also, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard people like his house was essentially like a bed, a sofa, and books, right? That was all the thing in his house was books. I imagine now that he's married, that's probably changed a bit, but yeah. But so I've had that example in my life from my dad to my platoon sergeant, my company commander, people in the agency, people in the Pentagon. And then, obviously I talk a lot about military when it relates to Stoicism, although I really try to push that it shouldn't just be for military people in Stoicism. It should be
Yeah.
people from all aspects, education, healthcare, science for sure.
Yeah.
Whatever, it needs to be, and it always wasn't, I think, intended to be a philosophy for everyone.
Yeah.
So I talk about it a lot, which I understand because of my background, but I always plug that uh, I hope we get every military member into Stoicism, but I hope we also get every, teacher, nurse, fill in the blank
Yeah.
part of society into Stoicism. Well, I think we'd be better off for it.
So do you feel like, excuse me, do you feel like there is this sort of overarching discussion that really pushes Stoicism being towards the military, or do you feel like that's a misconception and it's really because when I look at Stoicism, I think a lot about its roots, right? It starts in the Stoa, in the Agora, in Athens, and it's not. There's probably soldiers there, or people who have been soldiers, but it's really actually a philosophy of the street, right? But do you feel like nowadays it really gets overly pushed as militaristic, or is that just a really big misconception by the public, do you think?
So I think it's a misconception that Stoicism is militaristic.
Right.
I don't think it's a misconception that the military, if there's a philosophy that permeates the military, it's Stoicism.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm just thinking out loud as we're talking about this, and I'd like to hear an actual historian. But if you think about who would have been the audience on the Stoa,
Yeah.
right? This was just at the time of the Peloponnesian War, which went on for years and years and years.
Yeah.
So what is most young men in Athens would have done by then? Served as soldiers in the Peloponnesian War, which they lost, which is one of the reasons why I think Plato's Republic is so focused on a group he calls the Guardians, right? That essentially looks like the Spartans. They look, act, and they're it's somewhat of an obsession of the Athenians, who were much stronger, had much higher like GDP and population, and like they should have won. But they were obsessed with the Spartans themselves because of their just ferocity and discipline. And I think if you look at who would have been the early Stoics, again, I'd like to hear an actual historian, not just me.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think it's fair to say a lot of them would have been current soldiers or had served already. And I'm guessing that would have been the case. So it might have been the early framework. We talk about the leaders of the school, but it might have been a majority of the students were soldiers or prior soldiers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, when you think about the time period where it starts, you're also in a period of time where it is common to have war breaking out somewhere. And these are small in comparison, right? But you and I both come from countries where there hasn't really been a war on within that country, right, for a long time, right? And so we're in a circumstance where war is in many ways distant. At least I'm in Canada. War to me is a distant thing. Like it in the sense of geographically, it happens somewhere else. But back in the time period that we're discussing, right? We're talking about there's a constant threat from the east, from Persia, right? There's a constant threat from the south, or I can't remember where Sparta is in relation to Athens right now, but there's a constant threat from within the Peloponnese, right? There's a threat from across the Mediterranean Sea, from North Africa, right? There's a threat from Rome, from Syracuse, from the city states in what is now Turkey. And then, of course, if you head north, you get into Macedonia and all that. So I think it was a lot more prevalent at that time. I mean, I'm not a historian. I was a classical history major back in the day, but I wouldn't call me anything other than a fan at this point. But I think I agree with you, though. You're in a time period where it just so happens to be that this is something that happens a lot more often, right? You just don't really see it as much here. With us. And so, you can feel detached from it. But back in that day, even if you weren't a soldier, right? We know that during the Peloponnesian War, the the farmers and the citizens of the city who were living on outside of the walls of Athens, right? The farmers and whatnot, their crops are being raised. They're losing everything all the time from raiding people or whatever. And it is really all the time, right? It's happening a lot in that time
Mm-hmm.
period. One of the reasons why they started forming the leagues, right, like the Delian League, is because they're trying to
Mm-hmm.
kind of get
Yep.
everybody together and stop this constant inter-Peloponnesian fighting.
Yeah.
So I think we just have to kind of keep that in mind from a contextual point of view. But I've always seen it as something that just kind of makes sense. In my world, the space program is not a military program. At least in Canada, it is not. And in the States, NASA is not. It's still I guess you'd call it a civilian organization, right? Like it's a circumstance where you get a lot of military people in there because it's another one of those things where you're in sort of a base human existence type of thing. If things go wrong a certain way, someone could die, someone could be injured severely, and when you're in space, you're on your own, right? In many ways.
Yeah.
So I think it comes up a lot there, and we've talked about doing an episode of Stoicism in the space program. I know that was your suggestion, was we do one of those, right? And it is something that kind of comes up because I think it's another one of those circumstances where it's the crucible that burns away all of this other stuff and gets to that base human existence that you have to kind of pay attention to. And having a guidebook for that is really, really useful. In fact, all of the, or not all, but most of my most famously well-known NASA engineers like Gene Kranz or George Low, they all had military backgrounds. Gene Kranz was in the Air Force, and then he was in the Air Force test pilot school as well. So it's like, it kind of makes sense that NASA, the space program kind of had that, as well as all the astronauts up until essentially the 70s and 80s, all the astronauts were fighter pilots, right? They were test fighter pilots. So
a lot of them are today.
Yeah. And many of them are today still, which I mean, it makes sense. High performance jets is what you need to know how to fly when you're going to be flying a high performance spacecraft. So is there any misconception around this kind of topic, though, that you feel we haven't discussed? I'm always curious about that because no one would ever ask me about this because I'm not in the military, and I would always say, well, I don't really know. I'm not in the military. But are there any misconceptions you think we haven't talked about yet that would be good to sort of set correct? Or
we did a whole episode on misperceptions of Stoicism. The like no emotion. It's not about having no emotions. It's about being able to control your emotions, especially the negative ones like anger, right?
Yeah.
Or jealousy.
Yeah.
And the idea that a soldier is also devoid of emotion is obviously not the case, nor should you not be. Should you be that kind of Terminator type entity? That's not the case. And that's not what Stoicism is about. Stoicism, but it is important. I mean, every aspect of Stoicism has a direct application to the battlefield, right? Which is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to being a soldier. So if you lose your cool, you're likely going to lose the fight. You have to keep your head about you, even in the worst scenarios. When, like, for example, when you're ambushed, right? That's the worst scenario, right? That means somebody else has planned to attack and destroy you, and you went right into it. That's what an ambush is, right? So that means the element of surprise is on their side. Speed is likely on their side. Every aspect of combat is on their side. If you don't keep your cool and you just you break down as a unit and people start running, hiding, whatever, your chances of complete annihilation go up substantially. So having that calmness under pressure, the keep calm and carry on, which I think obviously is a British thing, but I think the British Empire was completely permeated with the concepts of Stoicism that came from whether it was the Alexander the Great or the Roman Empire or the then Holy Roman Empires, the British Empire, and even the United States and Canada, which are obviously offshoots of the British Empire. Stoicism has been part of it. You don't want to oversay it, but I think it's fair to say it's essentially been hand in glove with the development of Western civilization since 500 BC when democracy started in ancient Athens.
Yeah,
it has been a part of it. So I think it's part of, and of course the military loves its history, right? So
Yeah.
it's probably of all the organizations that is tied to its history, that talks about its history, that has events that celebrate the history, that everybody's required to know, specific dates and people, and so it's also very much a part of the history. And since the military focuses so much on history, it's yet another reason why Stoicism uh, has made not only a substantial comeback in modern society, but that same thing is in the military, right? So
Yeah.
I've done lectures at the Naval Academy, for example,
Yeah.
and so is Ryan Holiday, and I think they have a lot of Stoic speakers
Yeah. Donald Robertson
at these.
spoke at. Is there a Marine Corps Academy? I forgot
It's
to
the
ask
Naval
you.
Academy is
The Naval
the Marines
Academy.
go to
Yeah.
the Naval Academy. It's the military academies, the Army, Air Force Academy, obviously, and then Naval Academies,
Right.
Navy, and Marine Corps. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's definitely there. So before we sign off, I wanted to see we were talking a little bit before about some references that you think would be good to cite or anything like that. So if there's anything,
Yes.
I think.
Thanks for giving me a chance to plug young Will Spears' book that's coming out. He is a Naval Academy graduate and a submariner, which means he's an officer on a submarine, which can be
Right.
pretty dang difficult.
Yeah.
But he has a book coming out called The Warrior Philosophy, Stoicism, and the Morality of Military Service. So I wrote a little spot for him, for the front cover or what have you. So super excited to see this come out. I think it will be required reading, and I've read it, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Very well done, and I think it will be. Maybe it'll be on the Commandant's reading list one day. That'd be cool.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
good for him.
Well, we
Will
wish
Spears.
Mr. Spears well on his journey with that book. I think we cited it earlier, but I think it's a really important one to mention. James Stockdale's Thoughts of a Philosophical Fighter Pilot is one. Mick, you've read it, I think, right? I've read it.
Of course.
It's actually interesting because it's a series of lectures that are put together, but I do think it's a very good read. And is a very practical read because it's written by someone who's literally shot down over, I believe it's Vietnam, and then he's parachuting down and watching the North Vietnamese troops coming to pick him up. But he's going, okay, this is going to be a while before I get home, and I have to think about it. I think the quote is, I'm leaving the world of
Technology and entering the world of Epictetus.
Entering the world of Epictetus, right? Exactly. So, do highly recommend that book. So, and before we sign off, I think I'll prompt Mick a little bit on this one, but I think it's very important today to continue this legacy of talking about this that Mick and I are trying to do with this podcast. And I'm sure, I'm going to take a guess that there are going to be either members of the service or members who have been in the service in the past. So we'd love to hear from you. Keep an eye on our show notes. We have links to some of our social media and whatnot. So we'd love to hear from you and hear what your experience is like on, if you experienced Stoicism in the military or you took it with you into the military or in some other service that you've done. So I think, Mick, I'll give you a second if you wanted to say anything on that topic, because we are trying to get the audience to join us in this discussion.
Yes, maybe we start a Pub and Porch Legion, right? That would be cool.
That would be
right? We can be legionnaires. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just like with anybody in the audience, we view this as a team effort. So we want we're not professional professors. Yeah. We are just average Joes speaking about a philosophy that we hope we can gather an audience for and have a group, solid team. So yeah, let's start the Pub and Porch Legion and see if we can get folks to come with us.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good place for us to end, though. So thanks again for listening to us here on Pub and Porch Applied Stoicism. I guess this is Adam and Mick signing off. So thanks, Mick. We'll see you on the next one.
All right. Thank you for listening to the Pub and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pubandporch.com, and you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pubandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pub and Porch out.